Welcome, everyone, to this plenary titled Disrupting the Status Quo, Mobilizing Action to Address Anti-Asian Racism. Before we embark on a conversation with our panelists about resistance against systemic racism within institutional spaces of higher learning, I'll begin with a land acknowledgement with the hope that we do more than acknowledge the land that we live and work on, but also put decolonial action to words beyond symbolic gesture, as this too often, even and perhaps especially in an era of truth and reconciliation, has become part of a liberal politics of distraction and inaction. The land we are meeting on virtually today has been and continues to be home to Indigenous people since time immemorial. I would like us to express our deepest gratitude to the Indigenous nations who have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which our universities are located and that precede the establishment of these universities, which have and in many cases continue to explicitly and or covertly uphold colonial structures of violence and benefit from continued land dispossession. X-University, formerly Ryerson University, which is undergoing a name change because of its namesake's role as one of the architects of the residential school system, is located in Toronto. These territories are subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty, a living record of diplomatic agreement between the Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land, the waters, and all living beings within. It was stated in the Great Law of Peace that we promise to have only one dish among us, which means that we will always have equal shares of the game roaming about in the hunting grounds and fields, and then everything will become peaceful among all the people, and there will be no knife near our dish, which means that if a knife were there, someone might get cut, causing bloodshed, and this is troublesome should it happen. Thus, and for this reason, there should be no knife near our dish. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of genuine peace, respect, and reciprocity. As treaty people, it is our responsibility, our obligation, to ensure that the dish is never empty and walk gently on the land. This involves showing up in solidarity with Indigenous nations who have always and continue to struggle for land back and sovereignty. For those joining from outside of Toronto, I encourage you to learn about and acknowledge the Indigenous territories and unique histories of the places where you are located. We must remember that a land acknowledgement must be more than a performative liberal ritual, but rather be accompanied with substantive decolonizing practices, including building sustainable relationships of solidarity with Indigenous people. This is an opportunity to reflect on our relationships to the places we are in, on how territories have been defined, on the enduring life and resurgence of Indigenous people and their ongoing relationship with the land, and on the many ways we benefit from living and working on Indigenous territories and from Indigenous leaders, elders, educators, and activists. The starting point of this national forum is the understanding that anti-Asian racism is intrinsically tied to the hate, systemic discrimination, and racism experienced by many other racialized and marginalized communities. This forum thus aims to highlight the relationship between anti-Asian racism and settler colonialism and anti-Black racism. It explores how we can learn from each other's anti-racist struggles and decolonization projects. Ultimately, the aim is to build alliances and solidarities, to identify strategic priorities and recommend bold actions to be implemented in universities across the country. When I was invited to moderate this panel on resistance and solidarities, I was reminded of Murray artist and activist Lila Watson's critical message. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time, but if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. In this spirit, I imagine that this panel would engage in conversation about our collective struggle for liberation involves identifying and challenging the white supremacist forces locally and globally that at once thrive on the brutal dispossession of Indigenous people, anti Black racial violence, and Orientalist imperialism that has shaped the lives of many Asian populations in different but related ways. In such a political context where we are variously invited to participate in upholding capitalist, colonial, and imperial domination, how can students, faculty, and staff disrupt the university status quo to incite change? How do we challenge institutional racism within Canadian universities? How do we mobilize the changes we need within the institution to build solidarities? And I want to add to these guiding questions, if the goal is to create the transformative change needed for a more equitable future for everyone, to draw from Black feminist activist Audre Lorde, can we dismantle the master's house with the master's tools? Or drawing from Marie-Joseph Angelique and others who have been erased, annihilated from the official record, must we tear it down? We have 4 esteemed panelists to join in this conversation. Dr. Hayden King is Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation on Chimnising and is the Executive Director at Yellowhead Institute, advisor to the Dean of Arts on Indigenous Education, and an Assistant Professor of Sociology at X University. He has taught at McMaster and Carleton Universities, held senior fellowships at Massey College and the Conference Board of Canada, and served in senior advisory roles to provincial, territorial, and First Nations governments. He is the co-founder of the language arts collective Ogima Mikana Project, the co-host of the Red Road podcast, and a mentor in the Jane Glasgow Northern Fellowship. Dr. Melanie Knight is president of the Black Canadian Studies Association, advisor to the Dean of Arts on Blackness and Black Diasporic Education, and an associate professor of sociology at X University. Her research interests include Black activism and organizing, Black collective economic initiatives, and Black business owners. Her current Shirk Insight grant will examine Black-led organizations from the late 19th to mid-20th century and the ways in which Black communities mobilized around issues of health, policing, and education. She has also worked on a number of initiatives aimed at addressing anti-Black racism, including most recently helping with the development of guidelines for a provincial anti-Black racism AQ from the Ontario College of Teachers. Dr. Eve Haque is professor in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics, and is the York Research Chair in Linguistic Diversity and Community Vitality. She is also co-editor of Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies. Her research and teaching interests include multiculturalism, white settler colonialism, and language policy, with a focus on the regulation and representation of racialized immigrants in white settler societies. She has published widely on these topics, including a monograph, Multiculturalism Within a Bilingual Framework, Language, Race, and Belonging in Canada. Binish Ahmed is an Asian Indigenous Kashmiri Muslim cis woman who works as an educator, multimedia artist, writer, and a community connector and organizer. Born in Srinagar, Kashmir, she currently lives and works in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant territory. Her academic and community organizing work focuses on solidarity with Indigenous movements for self-determination and resurgence. The Alchemy of Making Soft Landings on Sharp Places is her first book, a collection of poetry, stories, and art released in April 2021. Her written works can also be read in The Room magazine, Upping the Ante, Conversation Canada, Amnesty International, Feral Feminism's Journal, Indigenous Policy Journal, and Rabble. Binish is a member of Justicia for Migrant Workers, has been organizing for Kashmir with Kashmir Gopash, and is the host of Azadi Now. She is completing a PhD in policy studies at X University, holds a master's in public policy from Brock University, and a BA honors from the University of Toronto, with a political science major, history, and South Asian studies double minors. I also want to mention that Dr. Hee-jung Serenity Ju unfortunately sends her regrets as she had to withdraw from the panel due to the University of Manitoba Faculty Association strike that began on November 2nd. And I am Laura Kwak, Assistant Professor of Sociolegal Studies at York University, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. And we have a set of questions to consider today, and some others that I imagine the panelists would like to address as well. And so our conversation will be semi-structured, and we'll go for about an hour. And the questions, I can state them first, and we can then go back. Through your lived experiences and observations, what do you consider to be the status quo? Why does it need disrupting? Can we challenge institutional racism within Canadian universities? How can change be fully realized in challenging institutional racism? In order to disrupt the status quo in higher education, what are your recommendations to incite change? In the process of institutionalizing change, what does solidarity and allyship look like? How can we show up for other communities in our collective ambition for change? And I'd like to add to this, when we say Asian or anti-Asian racism, who do we mean by Asian? And how might we also fold in questions about inter-Asian racism? So maybe we can go back to the first question. What is the status quo? And anyone can jump in. What is the status quo in the context of the university, in context of the broader settler colonial society, capitalist patriarchal society? Why does it need disrupting? And perhaps has the status quo come to include EDI, incorporation, neutralization, pacification, all of these strategies that are not new, but somehow continue to.
I could go first.
Sure, yes.
Yeah, so I guess that's such a big question, and each one of us will probably have a different answer depending on where we're located intersectionally. For me, I'd like to start by just saying Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you, but just kosher, it means I'm from Kashmir. To me, anti-Asian racism is something that cannot be treated in isolation. To me, it manifests in an interlocking system in conjunction with anti-Muslim racism, anti-Indigenous racism towards Kashmiri people like myself. It exists as misogyny, and it exists as ableism towards differently able people like myself. So those are all interlocking ways that I'd like to propose we think about anti-Asian racism and how it's manifested. So it's violent. It manifests culturally, structurally, as well as in our everyday lives. To give you examples of how it manifests for people like myself within the academy, it's for non-natives to be myself, but also other Indigenous peoples or non-natives to be claiming to be us and self-indigenizing. We've heard a lot of this happen within the academy with claims to Indigenous identity by people without an Indigenous background in the Canadian, settler colonial Canadian context, but this is actually also true for Kashmiris, where non-natives are self-indigenizing, and I'm not going to go into how that manifests, but it's being statewide instituted by the settler colonial Indian state. It also manifests in terms for someone like myself in when I present myself as Indigenous to be laughed at and to be ignored, not just like generally, but also by senior academics who kind of just scoff and like walk away, unless it's like someone who's prominent who will say it and then validate it. I had this experience and many such experiences like for years now. And people ask me like, "What do you mean you're Indigenous?" And I say, "Well, I'm Kashmiri," and this is when they kind of walk away. We could talk more about that later, but it's also it manifests as the decentering of our voices in matters about us, when others are chosen to represent us or speak for us or speak over us while we're still alive. And while they claim to be allies in doing this kind of speaking for us or over us, it's having our voices, having voices of other people privilege over ours as more credible, as valid. For someone like myself, it's being called a terrorist, or people like myself being called terrorists, militants, Islamists, criminals. It's having our knowledges stolen within the institutions only to be reproduced without attribution or acknowledgement. It's to be silenced when speaking out and looking for justice and accountability within these systems. It is to be targeted and blacklisted for speaking out, to being exploited in the academy, in the Eurocentric academic plantation slave labor, as precarious workers doing educational, artistic research labor. It's having senior administrators come to the front of our classrooms, sometimes telling us that we can't teach about colonialism because it's hurting the feelings of white students who have gone to them crying. That's also a real experience. It looks like having people privately empathize with us and publicly ignoring us and excluding us. It looks like the privilege of publicly acknowledging systemic violences by senior administrators, by people towards people such as myself and other BIPOC people, but privately refusing to be accountable or to fund programming that would change the circumstances or our conditions, right? Because to them it's optional. It looks like, and I specifically, when I say that, I'm specifically talking about students. It looks like state policing bodies, like from the institutional standpoint, seeing people like myself as threats to national security, where we're surveilled by CSIS, RCMP, OPS, other policing bodies, monitoring us, surveilling our families. In my case, it's not just a settler colonial Canadian state, but it's also the Indian state doing this from being located around the globe. So it's a transnational surveillance system targeting people like myself. And it's, um, it's my Muslimness, my Kashmiriness, my Indigenousness, and my involvement in Indigenous resistance movement for self-determination and governance that are seen as threats to the status quo. It looks like being treated as excludable, exploitable, displaceable, and dispossessable. Too often we're people like myself, like particularly racialized women like myself, are expected to be quiet. We're expected to be obedient, subservient, continue to cater to demands for free labor at these institutions where our knowledges are taken up and our bodies and our identities are erased. It's being consumed as an oriental, exotic, sexual subject, and often being, people have come to me and given that to me as a compliment, as if like, I should revel in the joy of being desired. So those are some of the things that I wanted to present as what I see as problematic status quo.
Thank you, Binish. I'm hearing that the status quo includes problematic structural, relational forces at multiple scales within our communities, as well as from multiple states and institutions. I was wondering if anyone on the panel wants to add or respond to Binish's comments.
I mean, there was a lot there. I think Binish covered a lot of the, covered it. So I think that there are a lot of structural elements to this conversation, what the status quo is. But I think in response to your original question, Laura, or the addendum to your original question, I think that there's something interesting there to talk about beyond, conceptualizing the status quo as these structural conditions that we live in, both generally, but also at the university, and then, of course, at an individual level, the status quo operates in these different registers. But I think what's interesting when you mentioned EDI as an element of the status quo, I think we have to consider that and think through how the status quo shapes and changes and evolves to resistance from Indigenous, Black, Asian communities. And in a lot of ways, I think I struggle with this a lot. I think, speaking about my own personal experiences, I had this experience about 6 months ago where I sat down to write an op-ed for a newspaper, and I started to look through my old files to see if there was something I could use. And I realized I had written the exact same op-ed like 7 years ago. And here I was writing the same piece that was supposed to be topical and supposed to respond to, these important issues in Canadian society. And it just struck me how we go through these cycles. There are these moments where our resistance percolates and boils over, and then we have these national conversations, whether they're forums, whether they're about the name of the university. And then I think the status quo, however we define it or however we ascribe agency to it, is able to capture that resistance. And I think of what the Chinese American historian Evelyn Hugh Duhart talked about when she said this is a type of fire insurance that the university will offer, right? So if students are acting up, if Asian students are acting up, Black students are acting up, let's offer them these little trinkets, or what we would call ishkanagan, the scraps, and maybe that's EDI. Maybe that's the fire insurance that Evelyn Hugh Duhart was talking about. Like, let's offer them EDI so they won't burn the place down, which is what Binish was saying, or what we were talking about in the green room earlier. So I guess that I'm really interested when we're talking about the status quo and how we conceptualize the status quo, in also talking about how it evolves. And I don't mean to be euphemistic here and just have the status quo as a stand-in for settler colonialism or capitalism or patriarchy, but this transit of the status quo, to borrow a phrase from Jody Bird, is sort of what I'm interested in trying to understand. And I think your question around EDI is a really compelling one. And takes us in the direction of trying to understand it. Maybe as fire insurance, maybe as something meaningful. TBD, I guess.
Right. Thank you. I think this is a helpful way to think about the purpose of a conversation like this or a forum like this. Who is it for? And, the evolution of state anti-racism, as you said, works in these cycles. And if one way to legitimate resistance is to become legible in particular spaces that are within the university or across universities, and we know that this is not new of a liberal kind of incorporative strategy, then what can we do that might be different and break these cycles? This is a question I've been thinking about, and I'm sure the panelists have all been thinking about because of the work that we do as, on our own. But then together, I'm really, when I was preparing my remarks, thinking about, I've had this conversation, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, about solidarity building, and what could we do that's different this time? Noting that state anti-racism or institutional anti-racism often pacifies radical potential. Is this, maybe leading to some of the other questions, can we challenge institutional racism in Canadian universities, in our experiences? Like having done my undergrad at Queen's and then my master's at York and at U of T, my PhD, I just feel like I'm not sure it is possible, but I don't know what other people think about this.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean it can't be done, but at the same time,
Yeah.
history is a fortune teller.
If I
Melanie.
can add a few, thank you, Binish, Hayden, and Laura as well for those points. Laura, if I can go back, I don't know if we can either, but you had to bring EDI in there, which is great. But, when I think of the status quo, and this, connects to EDI in a sense, there's an assumption for me, I'm something about bureaucracy. There is an assumption in bureaucratic change or any change. What we've seen to date, but not even just to date, task force, committees, reports, EDI initiative, right? All kind of mushrooming kind of exponentially at certain times. But for me, what often remains, and this is where the status quo, the practices that erase, universalize, and sort of negate non-whiteness remain. So there's an illusion of progressiveness, of action. But when you actually look at the practices that are in place, those are very anchored, and folks are very committed and embedded and help me out, invested in those practices, maintaining themselves. Things, standardizations, measurements, weighing, those things. So no EDI lipstick can move those practices. So I find I'm getting to, and we can certainly add to recommendation. I find we are lacking in sort of institutional ethnographies, which is to understand how it is that these particular practices came to be, before trying to whoop up committee and we'll add a person and we'll add how is it that this, we've had now statements against anti-Asian racism. But if we're to look at the actual things that we are proposing, how are the practices re-legitimizing violence and maintaining the status quo? So that's just to your first question, but I'll Eve, I'm not sure if you want to add something, but then, certainly I hear you on what do we do, and can we within this university space?
Thank you, Melanie. Well, you've all been so eloquent and detailed. There's not much left for me to add, but I will say that when I saw the question, because you sent them to us, what is the status quo immediately came to mind. And I was like, oh, that's easy. It's white supremacy. So, but then what we need to think about, and then white supremacy becomes embedded in settler colonialism. So, I can never talk about settler colonialism without saying white settler colonialism, for example, and so on and so forth. But then that question of the practices emerges, I think, as you so rightly said, Melanie, because what we just have is this chain of signifiers. They're shifting all the time. we went from diversity to diversity and inclusion. Now we have JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. We've got EDID with decolonial tacked on the end. But at the end of the day, precisely as you ask, what are the practices that in the end make all these acronyms, these words just really mean the same thing? I love this EDI lipstick, right? Basically, that's what we're seeing. And, I think one way to drill down into that is to talk about very specific cases and examples, because we do need to reveal the bureaucratic processes whereby, the status quo is maintained. The institution is, the institution is built on stolen land. So why are we all of a sudden expecting it to do all these things that are going to go against the very genealogies upon which these institutions emerge? That is going to be the bigger struggle. And EDI has come to represent something that is not possible and capable. And I'm going to be specific here then. And maybe we can build on some other examples. What I see EDI, or the EDI lipstick, as I'm now going to call it, and cite you, Melanie, Night 2021, is basically representational loading. Particularly in higher levels at central administration, the proliferation of VPs, equity / people / culture is remarkable within the last few years. And basically, soon all the universities will have such a person. Good people, these are people who have a great track record, but they're people of color, they're Indigenous, they're Black, they're Asian, and we've got to come back to that term. And I think, people who are well-intentioned, but then what happens when you move up into those ranks? What is possible? What is not made possible for you to do? And what then do you represent to the institution? What do you represent to the people? For I can tell you at York, we fought very hard to get a VP equity position. And we got an Indigenous woman who is a really noted scholar and so on. But at the same time, the practices remain. And the example I'm going to give you is a very difficult one to talk about. But what happened in that office, the VP equity office, was the Cromwell report was passed. This Cromwell report, recommends more TPS presence on campus, recommends the IHRA definition on anti-Semitism. This report was commissioned by central administration and was passed by that office without any discussion. We have a Senate. We also have a working group on free speech and academic freedom that is populated by students and by faculty and staff representatives. So these practices remain even as we create these, even as we bring in representatives from us, right? Any of us could be called into these positions, but what is possible and what is not possible in those positions? What practices remain that retain and maintain the status quo? I think just getting a definition of the status quo is probably not going to be enough. We really need to dig into how does the status quo, how does it operate? The how question there is really big for us to get at. Otherwise, we're just going to get different shades of lipstick coming down the line, and it's not going to make any difference. We've seen that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Eve, Melanie, Hayden, Binish. I think the points you're raising about processes and the becoming and the ongoing becoming of the status quo is important to think about, because as representatives, we are called into doing a particular kind of work under the guise of racial progress or progress, and then it comes back to my question, who is it for at the end of the day? And if we're busy doing this work for the institutions that remain committed to structures of racial and colonial violence, then from my experience as well as when I was a student organizer, community and on campus, this is a way of creating legitimate and good subjects, and then the radical ones, right? And sometimes I was considered, you're too radical. When you grow up, you'll know that that strategy doesn't work. People like you will die off. These are little things that people like in my community would say, and they're representatives as well. And so what are is the status quo, if it includes these more liberal gestures of incorporation and pacification, and is this a way to neutralize radical potential? And if we understand it as such, how might we redirect our energy to those communities, people outside of the university doing this work already and continue to face limitations or active repression from the state? And rather than imagining starting over again within the university, understanding that this work is already being done outside of it. I'm not sure if anyone wants to jump in.
I wanted to offer something that, just as I was reflecting on the questions for this session, something percolated. I really am struggling to see myself stay within the institution of, the ivory tower of higher ed as it currently manifests after I'm done my PhD. I don't think I think it's a very violent space for many reasons, and I'm not sure if I want to spend my life in such a space. And with all due respect to the folks who still stay and have that upward battle to try to transform such spaces, and it is because of people who have come before us that have made that space that we're even having this conversation today. But I still question it because it takes me such a far distance from who I am as a person, right? Can I be an embodied person and practice who I am while staying within this institution is a question mark. And I think I'm leaning towards a no at the moment. There are too many battles to fight, and there are too many ways that it chops away or hatches away at my sense of like humanity. But the thing that I've been thinking about is this idea that the status quo, this idea that the university is where all knowledge sort of is produced, or it's the site of rich wisdom and intellect, which is true. But the knowledges come from somewhere. They come from the communities. They come from families. They come from like children. They come from elders. These are and I just I find that like there's such important work of knowledge production happening outside the academy that I'd be satisfied in those spaces as well. And so, I feel like I'm so far away from this conversation in like thinking through EDI as a space of transformative change in the academy. Like, I feel like it's way too compliant and complicit. Like when I've made requests, they're just like, there's just not funding, or you're asking for too much, you're asking too often. And I'm I have one life to live, and in my lifetime, like, do I really want to stay here and spend my time like constantly just hearing you're too much or not enough, right? So I just like to offer those as some thoughts.
Thank you, Binish. I think you're feeling what you're expressing is that you don't feel like you belong in these particular spaces, which is indicative of the violence in these spaces, despite initiatives like EDI, etc. But I wonder if anyone else wants to jump in.
I mean, it's really unfortunate to hear about these kinds of experiences, and I don't think that they're uncommon. I mean, EDI is definitely getting a bad rap in this panel. I don't even know if we've, maybe the status quo is EDI. And I don't know if we've effectively even conceptualized what EDI is, but it's definitely one strategy to address the subject of the panel, this discussion of critical solidarities, right? Can it be done through a university bureaucracy that to a really great degree captures Indigenous, Black, Asian resistance to and recognizing that the terminology here might not be the appropriate ones, but I think it's one strategy, and I have to agree with Eve about these senior positions, and I wonder what it says about us and our theories of change at the university level. So why do we jump at these positions for senior administrators for Indigenous affairs or Indigenous relations, or why do we advocate for those? Because we know that they're set up to fail. We know that the university can then hide behind this Indigenous face that represents the university on what are effectively violent initiatives, and yet we still campaign for them. And I think that we have to reflect on the strategies that we deploy when we're trying to make change at the university when it comes to racism and representation. And that latter point makes me think about the successful campaign at X University to remove the statue and change the name, because we can talk about fire insurance, and we can talk about the structural conditions, but there is this nihilism sometimes that accompanies those conversations. Like, there is no alternative. It's like we're drowning in the oppression, and it's just fatigue and apathy, and there's nothing we can do and nothing we can change. I mean, that's exhausting for a student to hear, especially, but for faculty as well. So, like, why are we here? And so I think about that example with the statue, and back to your original question, Laura, around well, can you actually make change within these institutional structures? I think about how in that case, the university tried to offer us fire insurance. They tried to say, okay, we get you don't like the name of the university, named after a residential school architect. We get it. So we're going to put a plaque beside the statue. And the plaque is going to say Edgerton Ryerson was responsible for A, B, and C, but the statue is going to remain and the name is going to remain. So that was the fire insurance. And in this case, the Indigenous community said no. And I should mention Indigenous community with Black racialized allies said no, and then went out into the street, had a multifaceted campaign to push back against the name, ultimately tore the statue down with a pickup truck, and forced the university to change the name of the university. And so what that says to me is that there is a potential pathway out of the structural conditions using multi-pronged strategies, pulling on all the levers, not just the ones that are offered to us by provosts or presidents, ones that exist outside of the university structures that can actually inform and result in transformation within the university structure. So, can we use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? I mean, I don't know. We can do some sabotage, though, I think.
That's not bad. Sabotage on the route to revolution. Better than nothing at all. Better than, legitimizing the status quo. Melanie or Eve, do you want to jump in? I'm just thinking, as everyone's been speaking and listening, often, and I don't know what your individual experiences are, you're the one in any given space within academia, the only one. And so we become representative of a slew of things. And because we're the only one, there's a lot of expectations around the kind of work we can do outside of being a teacher, and a colleague. We are looked to when issues or questions about racism, colonial violence, police surveilling on campuses, etc. We're turned to for answers or to do extra work, and then these positions open up and get filled, and then those same spaces in the ivory tower look a little bit different but sound a lot the same as before. What do we, where am I going with this? I mean, okay, so how does, I'm noticing that the kind of microaggressions I face at work or in doing this work haven't really changed. In fact, they've become more difficult to name and for people to believe that misogyny, patriarchy, racism still exists. It's as though, you know, I'm still seen as, well, you're exaggerating. That can't be true. We have AA, we have all these other task forces and people who have read the equity myth, and therefore, what are you talking about? Why are you complaining? Why are you making so many demands still, as Binish said, right? So while there is this supposed shift toward progress, it has become even more difficult to actually name and challenge it as well.
Can I add, these positions are also very interesting, but just to use an example, when you say, you know, can we make change within? I'm conflicted. I don't know. I don't know. I love sabotage. I mean, the master's tools, the master can't know you're using the tool to unravel. So you got to do a lot of work but that's definitely possible and really fun, really, really great. But here's the other thing that as of late is really problematic with these positions when you're trying to do a little bit. And, you know, Hayden and I have an example where high toxicity levels of anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism felt in the classroom from within, from without, not just recent, sharing with us then having experienced it ourselves, I'm speaking personally, saying, okay, we have to do something. And being hit with a barrage of policies that you inherited, you fail to account, have been borrowed, are, you know, state kind of mirrored. And not only are you asked to solve all of it, you're asked to untangle all these policies. Now what? So the burden of responsibility is really interesting on whom it falls in all of this. Get to stepping, start. And the amount of people that put appointments in my calendar to get me to work, woo! Initially I said, wait a minute, what was that? What happened? I had a day. I had a day to direct outside. It's gone. Governing my movements and where and how I should, and the energies, my energies that I should devote. So I don't know about within, but what is I'm torn with is our kids are here. Black kids are here, Asian kids are here, Indigenous kids are here. They're coming through. So that requires, I personally, of me, something. And that I'm torn to say, I don't think this space can give us what we need. But we're here. You know, should I let it further damage? Right? So what I want to impart oftentimes in trying to teach about, we haven't gotten to kind of Asian, anti-Asian racism, the category of Asian. Students often feel as if either it's non-existent, anti-Asian racism, what are you talking about? Either non-existent, or we've gotten into this practice of, I'm using the word practice too often, of ticking off an understanding of events or occurrences. Well, no, I know about settler colonialism. Already? No, I know about slavery. Okay. Can we talk about the centuries and the ways in which the institution of white supremacy, of slavery, have maintained themselves, and have maintained themselves? Those have not disappeared. So there's still good work that can happen. Crafting space to do it, finding good folks to do it with you who are supportive. I guess I'm still somewhat optimistic. And as Hayden said with the statue, those moments that uplift.
I really, really love all of what you just said, and I just want to add something. I was listening to Plenary number 2 about racism in the classroom, and there are two things that were brought up in that session by Dr. Megan Scribe and Dr. Reese, which is, so then how do you tackle this, right? And what they brought up was this reference to Tuck and Yang on decolonization is not a metaphor. And to talk about when we address the classroom as a space of manifestation of racisms and misogyny, all these different structures and systems of violence, we have to dismantle the classroom itself and pull it apart in pieces. And then ask, who has this current system been working for and how, and who does it need to work for instead, and what would that look like? And I don't think that work of decolonization can be taken up by an EDI office, frankly. I think this needs to be, we have to step back, right? We have to ask about this whole institution. Like, how is it set up? How is the funding operating? Who is the funding going to? How is it distributed? How are different people valued? Who is invisibilized and whose labor is visibilized, and who's valued more and less in spite of doing the same kinds of labor? Like, I'm thinking about precarious contract faculty versus the tenure system faculty, right? Where contract precarious faculty, the QP faculty, are often racialized people, right? For the vast majority, and the tenure track has up until traditional this point, vast majority are white faculty, and we're trying to change that. But I would say that we really have to pull the whole system apart in disrupting the status quo and the way the institution is set up, and think about alternative ways that really center our principles of decolonization.
Can I just jump in? Thank you for that. I think, we hear some of these thoughts and conversations over and over. Let's decolonize. Let's change up the professoriate. Let's do this. Again, I just want to bring us back to the how question. I think the how question is really important, because it would be really naive to assume that people haven't thought about doing that and people haven't done that. The University of Maroons is a book that goes back decades. So the idea of the neoliberal university that reproduces itself is not a new one. And lots of great books have come out since then, all the way up to the equity myth. So I just, what is we need to think about what is the way that these institutions reproduce themselves, and how are we who seek to shift and change that trajectory, that white supremacist trajectory, how are we involved in trying to shift that? And I loved your example, Melanie and Hayden, about dealing with the statue of Ryerson at X University. I think what that showed was what might be possible through a coalitional politics. And I think that a discussion about strategy has to always be driven by these realities, us bringing and interpenetrating the realities of these institutions and where they're located, where the university does not have a clear boundary, between the place it's located, and I mean, given its location on stolen land, but even, let's say, the communities. So downtown for University X, but also at York, we're in a quote unquote priority neighborhood. Where do our students come from or not come from? What does it mean to have a university in a location that might be deemed a quote unquote priority neighborhood? It means that there are lots of poor brown and black bodies in those neighborhoods. It means that also students are then dumped into those neighborhoods. Are they housed? How are they housed? What kind of housing does the university contribute to? And then what does that mean for how people can live together, students, local residents, and so on? But also, York brings in 50,000 people onto its campus. What does it mean for a small city to come in and out of that neighborhood? This has been particularly salient during COVID. The policies that the university has around monitoring who's coming in and off campus affects the communities into which they arrive and through which they travel. We have these things like transition year programs, bridging programs, but these are all based on selection, limited spots. Are particular definitions of successes of these programs? Our union, for example, has a community projects program, which is about, giving back to the community by taking member donations. This is straight up a charity model, right? Where people sit around a meeting. I know I've been in these meetings and they're like, yeah, let's fund this basketball program for 6 weeks or 8 weeks. That's not bringing change to these it's not even bringing change. That's not even recognizing that our institutions are located in communities and we have obligations to each other because precisely of where we're located. And therefore, a politics of change and struggle, a strategy that doesn't think about that, doesn't prioritize that, is not going anywhere. And we're not going to break out of this trajectory of reproducing the white supremacist institution that seems to just do the same thing over and over, but they have new names for it each time. And so, I would sort of finish there with my comments, but I also want to say it also means understanding who's within our community, thinking about the institutional community, but the institution as part of a community broadly. And that means not buying into the white supremacist logic of hierarchies of oppression. And I think that brings us back to thinking about interlocking ways in which we're embedded in each other's struggles for liberation. And therefore recognizing very clearly what we mean by, for example, categories such as Asian. The category Asian, as it's taken up and this is not just, I bring this up because it becomes embedded in policy, conference organizing, institutional recognition, even data gathering. It does things, for example, like hide other violences and other forms of racism by, and I'll give you a really good, I think, a robust example that we see repeatedly at many institutions. The Asian stereotype that gets discussed and therefore becomes a dominant concern is that of the model minority. straight up, the brown student is not a model minority anymore, right? The brown student is a Muslim student, even if they're not, right? They may be Sikh, but they look like a Muslim. They'll get run over by a car and your entire family get wiped out in London, Ontario because you look Muslim. And what happens is these student groups get Muslim student associations, but also students who just look Muslim are being targeted by CSIS and RCMP on campus. They're being called up. I mean, this is such a pernicious problem that at U of T, they started a hotline. The Islamic Studies department had to start a hotline, not the institution, not Simcoe Hall, right? And of course, students don't know what to do. Sometimes they may be international, they're local. So if we don't disinter the who of, who we want to be in solidarity with, who's in our campuses, who's in our communities, then we can't begin to do these coalition politics appropriately. We're going to be stuck in a white supremacist logic of hierarchies of oppression, and it's going to take us nowhere. We're just going to be going in circles around and around. And I think we can do better. And I think there are examples of people doing better. I think you've given us one. I would love to see more of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Yeah, you raise very important points about the question of solidarity when even among Asian populations, people are not showing up for each other. And then what showing up looks like, or what contribution looks like, is in the charity model, as you said. Is this effective? Is this what will bring us social transformation? No. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in as we wind down our discussion, and we have about 10 minutes, thinking about where would you like us to head? Where would you hope we could go? What are examples of sabotage that we might invest in for
I would like
a
to...
larger, yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No,
yeah.
no, I want you to finish.
Oh, yeah. Just what might you think the otherwise would be to these versions of the status quo that haven't worked, but instead created so much pain and violence?
I've been thinking about the how, and it's all the different things that I get refused to exist in my wholeness in these institutions, right? Like we would have to make space, and for people like myself, like I'm not the only one, but like who makes the funding decisions at the institution? Like how is funding distributed? Like a radical redistribution would require that students have a very substantive say in that decision-making process, and that we privilege the voices of BIPOC people, right? Faculty, staff, students, people who do, give us food, make food for us in the cafeteria, people who clean and keep us in good health and good spirit. I want to see that. I want to see redistribution of power in the classroom and disrupting the master-slave dynamic, right? I want to see an end to policing on campus. I don't want to see any cops or security. We keep ourselves safe. We don't need these carceral institutional practices to quote unquote protect us. That's the place that I would want to send my daughter to, right? Dr. Melanie brought up, but we have kids, right? I do want my daughter to have a space to go to be in a nurturing space, in a loving space. And that's what that would look like. Those are just some thoughts. And, I really loved that conversation earlier. I was mentioning the plenary number 2, they brought up some really great examples of what that would look like in the classroom. So I would ask that we listen to conversations like that.
Hayden or Melanie, do you want to add any final remarks?
I think for me, solidarity is interesting, and Laura, you just mentioned it, without and within, people who want to govern what it should look like for you, and then within also it being very complex. One thing for me that has become more and more visible is, and our friend Sarah Stefana Smith, Laura, I think we need to question this idea of bafflement, at systemic racism, anti-Asian racism. It is labor intensive to try to, kind of teach people out of bafflement. In particular, white settlers who continually have this kind of idea of this is new, this is, and so in terms of solidarity and moving in a direction, bafflement for me needs a bigger conversation. I also think in terms of the how, and I don't know how this can happen necessarily, but a greater attention to an understanding and dissemination of sort of non-Eurocentric forms of knowledges. Without, and I say this because it is unbelievable how threatening it is perceived as. Threatening to, what is it called? Excellence. Threatening to, so the importance of having that, and having a space for that, governed not externally, not by these upper echelons. That in itself, to me, can be quite powerful. But as soon as it is deemed a threat, then it is pacified, it is kind of diluted, it is rendered, you see all kinds of things. So, and the last thing I'll say about solidarity, and I think my thoughts are, it's a little hot in here, so I'm sort of about to, I find it interesting how, and it comes back to knowledge, people make assumptions about ways to help. And the ways to help indicate to me that you actually don't know anything about me. Your offer has revealed to me where you actually stand. And, an example would be easing the burden on racialized, Black, Indigenous faculty individuals in some capacity, in whatever, it could be any type of example, in order to allow us, this is going to seem simplistic, in order to allow us to be with family, in order to allow me to be at the dinner table with my child. So I know if there are folks out there know our history, know what I'm talking about, because my parents, Black parents, who were personal support workers, who were nurses, caring for other families in homes, who were porters cross country, didn't have the time to, not that they didn't love, not that they abandoned. So that act is important for me. Yeah. Right? I need that time in order to counter what she will encounter.
Right. Yeah.
So are you there at that moment? Or you want me to be elsewhere and do something else for you? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. It's very hard. But I think that's where I'm conflicted of, yes, we're with you. Okay. Right now I need care. Mm-hmm. Right now I need care. You with me? Do you know how to be with me?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
The political must also be personal. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
How do we be ethical to each other in the way we relate to each other? Yeah. Yeah. Hayden? Anything?
I was hoping that Melanie would run out the clock and just keep going with this thread. Not to make Melanie work anymore. In all seriousness, I mean that's a really powerful explanation of what it's like to be Black in the academy, and I think that it applies to Indigenous experiences. And I wouldn't presume to speak for my East Asian or South Asian colleagues about their experiences, but maybe that's the case as well. And in this conversation we seem to be talking about these threads of grand structural change with sort of modest incremental change, and it happens in two levels, right? And maybe we don't have a unified theory of transformation, and that's why it's so difficult for us to figure out what it means to be in critical solidarity with each other, or what it means to provide these examples of hope or make the change. But as Melanie's talking, I'm thinking about the shifts that we have been successful at, or modestly successful at. We can hire folks. We can hire Indigenous faculty. We can hire Black faculty. And then they get here. We can hire Asian faculty. And when they get here, we discipline them into working in certain ways, into publishing in certain volumes, in service obligations that require a tremendous amount from us, and takes. And that's not to say that we don't want to work to build communities, but we want to work to build our collective communities. We're not necessarily invested in supporting and enriching and reconstituting or reproducing, as Eva says, the university community. And so for me, I think this really opens up questions about where my community is and who my community is. And I think that adds a dimension to this conversation of solidarity that might, maybe helps me think through these questions with a little more clarity.
Yeah. On that note, and I think because we all deserve to be with our families, and we do this work tirelessly, I want to thank you, the panelists, for engaging in conversation about resistance and solidarity building within and without universities. And thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened. And I hope that we will continue to name and challenge these structural problems, and pay attention to the possibilities of building healthy relational modes of work and being together. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
I want to thank all the organizers as well, behind the scenes, who have done
Yes.
tremendous work
Yes.
for making this possible, and Dr. Sujaman.
Thank you. Thank you, Binish.